And Calvin Coolidge is a austere Vermonter whose claim to fame as governor of Massachusetts was breaking the Boston police strike. And he takes office in 23, cleans up the Harding administration, and then is most kind of known for sort of this veneration of business and laissez-faire. I mean, Coolidge is ideologically going to believe the best thing the national government can do is as little as possible to get into the way. And Coolidge also believed that successful business was the key to prosperity for people. And so what the government should do is provide an environment in which business people can be successful. I mean, Coolidge is going to say, the man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. The business of America is business. And remember, we said in the Harding and Coolidge administration, they took actions to really clear the way for business prosperity. Under the direction of Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon, they slashed taxes, raised tariffs, limited, regulation. And so during the 1920s, an environment that was kind to business was perpetuated by, the presidents and Congress at that time, and business prospered. That's one of the reasons that Coolidge was so easily reelected or elected in 25 and 24. Another reason why Coolidge was elected in 24 is the Democratic Party was badly divided between wets and dries. Now, wets and dries. Dear Melissa, when we say wet in the 1920s, what does that mean? A wet is someone who largely believes, thinks, supports, or doesn't support what? So wets would be opponents of prohibition, right? Wets would typically be urban. Wets would typically be ethnic, potentially Catholic or Jewish or Orthodox, non-Protestants. More likely would be wets. Wets would be open to maybe new ideas. Dries would be traditionalists. White, Anglo-Saxon, rural, conservative, evangelical Protestants would tend to be more associated with being dry. Dries would be more likely to be found in the South and in rural areas. Wets would be more likely to be found in urban cities, particularly in the Northeast. Both wets and dries were part of the Democratic Party, correct? I mean, by 1924, there were wets and dries. The big city political machines of the Northeast were part of the Democratic Party. So was the Solid South part of the Democratic Party. They both joined the Democratic Party because they wanted to be left alone. The Solid South did not want Republican radical reconstruction. The big city political machines made up of immigrants didn't want Republicans to tell them not to drink alcohol or buy things on Sundays or things like that. So both of them joined the Democratic Party initially because they wanted to be left alone. But inherently they were different and suspicious of each other. And their differences and suspicions explode in the 1924 Democratic Convention. Remember, they vote 102 times in that convention before they nominate the stunning candidate John Davis, who is roundly defeated by Calvin Coolidge in the 24 election. Remember also how excited most of the country was when Coolidge announced that he was going to retire in 28 and Herbert Hoover announced that he was running for president. And Hoover, remember, was considered to be the most competent man in America when he ran for the presidency in 28. And when he was elected to the presidency in 28, there were high hopes that, that there would be great prosperity and the country would expand even further. But that's not what happens. The crash occurs, the Depression happens, and Hoover's response to the Great Depression was to sort of emphasize the things that he thought made America great in the first place. Self-help, cooperation, individuality, a spirit of community. And what Hoover believed is that the national government should promote the qualities and attributes that had made the country great in the first place. Now, we said contrary to what, is usually said about Hoover. Hoover does take action. In fact, he takes to some extent unprecedented action to address the problems of the Great Depression. But there is something that Hoover will not do. What is it that Hoover says, I won't do this, Kandrak?
He won't give out handouts.
Yes, he will not give out handouts. He will not support the direct dole. D-O-L-E, the direct dole. He will not support that. So he will encourage businesses. He creates committees. He even sponsors public works programs like the Hoover Dam. He creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is a company that is going to loan fledgling businesses and banks monies to keep them afloat. But he won't give the people handouts. He won't give them handouts of money, or will he give them handouts of jobs? Hoover, as a result of that, becomes somewhat unpopular, and one of the greatest manifestations of Hoover's unpopularity was his response to the bonus army. Does anybody besides Kelly Koo and myself remember who made up the bonus army, what they wanted, and what happened to them? Go ahead, dear Giles. It was a beautiful explanation, Giles. I heard most of it, but the rest of the kids in the class did not. So I'm going to repeat it if you don't mind. And what dear Giles said is they were veterans of World War I that had been proposed a bonus. What year? Anybody remember what year? Not that years are important. Go ahead.
Was it around like 45, I
No.
think?
Well, they were promised a
I was
bonus
gonna
at
say that.
45. You were correct.
Yeah.
They were promised it, but what year were they requesting the bonus? You were right about that. You got one part right. 32. So it's 32. An election year. Right, election year. And they wanted the bonus accelerated, and they decided to march to Washington to get it. 15 to 20,000 of them made it there. Did they get the bonus? They did not get the bonus. Did Herbert Hoover speak to them? He did not speak to them. What did Herbert Hoover eventually do to the bonus marchers? Go ahead, Kandrak.
He ordered the army to chase him out of Washington.
Douglas MacArthur, who eventually became the Supreme Military Commander of all Pacific Forces, was the person who chased the bonus army out of Washington, D.C., which made Hoover extraordinarily unpopular and results in sort of Hoover being associated with the misery of the Great Depression. Hoover hogs, Hoover blankets, Hoovervilles. Oh, what were Hoovervilles? This question is going to be on the AP test. Everyone's going to get it right. What were Hoovervilles? Go ahead, Mabe.
Like towns that people constructed to poor people without money.
Shanty cities that were established or that were created just out of junk that homeless people lived in outside of cities in flats. We call these Hoovervilles. I mean, they had no formal government associated with them or anything. They were just sort of these hastily erected shacks that desperate people lived in during the Great Depression. Now, when Franklin Roosevelt was running against Hoover for the presidency, what did he promise he would do? What did he promise he would do? Yes, guys.
Didn't you just say that he'd promised to do something?
Yes, he promised bold experimentation, right? That he would take actions, not very specific about what those actions would be, but he would take actions. Now, when he ascends to the presidency, remember, the country is fairly ready to follow him. He has significant majorities in the House and the Senate. People are desperate, so he has unprecedented authority, and influence with the Congress to take action. And he calls Congress into special session, and after calling Congress into special session, proposes a series of pieces of legislation that are collectively known as the First New Deal. The First New Deal happened in how many days?
100.
100 days. So sometimes it's called the first 100 days, sometimes it's called the First New Deal. During this time period, a plethora of legislation was passed to address many problems in society. And these pieces of legislation were intended to promote relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, recovery, and reform. Now, there were lots of things that were addressed. And remember, we said in class we weren't going to talk about all of them. But we did talk about some of them, that there are questions on the test. One was about banking. We talked about the Emergency Banking Act and the Glass-Steagall Act. Does anyone besides Aways and myself remember what the Glass-Steagall Act did? Go ahead, Aways.
I can't remember.
Kelly, go ahead.
I don't know.
Kendrick, go ahead.
They created the FDIC.
So you are saying in the aftermath of all those banks failing, 9,000 banks failing by 1933, that the national government